Okay, welcome everyone to our webinar today. I know we have some people who are still joining, but I am going to start with a little bit of administrative information about this webinar. So would like to let everybody know that everybody other than the panelists will remain muted through the presentation, but we would love your participation. And if you have questions for the panelists, please use the Q&A feature. You can hover to the bottom of your screen to see those features, and you can use the Q&A feature to submit questions for the panelists. We will also be sharing an archive of this webinar and a copy of the slides after the presentation. That's one of the most common questions, so I wanted to get that one out up at the top. And then also would love your interaction if you would like to use the chat window right now to introduce yourself. And we'd love to hear who you are and welcome you to our webinar. And again, if you have questions, please use the Q&A feature so we can make sure to easily track and make sure we reply to those, because the chat window can get really busy sometimes. So I'm going to say, great to have you here, and I'm going to turn it over to Clark McKown.
Thanks very much, Nova, and I'm happy to welcome everybody to the third in our webinar series on SEL competencies, what they are, and how to assess and address them. Paul, if you could go to the next slide, please, that'd be great. So last week we talked, the last two sessions we talked about specific social and emotional competencies. During the first of the webinar series we talked about social awareness. Last week we talked about self-management. And this week we're going to shift gears a little bit, and I'm really thrilled that Ryan Maas and Paul Bauer from Traverse Bay Area Intermediate School District are here with us today, and they're going to be sharing with the team specific information about how they've taken some of the ideas that we've been talking about in terms of linking standards to assessment to practice, how they've taken those ideas and put them into practice, because I know many of you agree with the general ideas we've been discussing, but have really wondered, okay, how do we actually execute these? And I think the team at TBA has really been on the cutting edge of doing innovative work to link standards, assessment, and practice. And we're super lucky to have them. And I'm going to go ahead and hand it off to Paul and Ryan to share with you the kind of work that they've been doing.
Thanks, Clark. Ryan and I both are excited to share the process that we've used within our intermediate school district, in the hopes that based on the content that Clark has shared with us the past couple of webinars, this might provide at least some ideas about way we can bring that research into practice. So we will be monitoring the chat throughout this and the Q&A feature. So again, if anything comes up, feel free to do that, and Ryan and I will be monitoring that, and we'll answer as many questions as we can throughout. So setting the stage, so our site context is we are an intermediate school district. We have about 24 public school districts and academies in our 5-county region. And just to note that we've had a variety of different system level work that has definitely addressed both the academic and behavior side, like positive behavior supports, MyBlissy formerly, which is a Michigan initiative, as well as the xSEL work or blueprint work. Another important thing to note is that Second Step is definitely the most commonly used curriculum across our ISD, and so a lot of our work was grounded in that specific curriculum to help it execute, but it is applicable regardless of whatever Tier 1 resources you may be using. So with that, Nova, if you don't mind posing the first poll question.
Absolutely. So we would love to know, reflecting on a large-scale initiative you have been a part of in the past, what were the most important factors to success that you felt. And we have options including leadership, teaching and learning, professional development, and learning environment buy-in. So I see we're getting lots of responses to that. We're gonna leave that open for a few more moments here. Okay, so looks like a fairly even spread, but certainly the learning environment and buy-in was a leading factor, but also lots of folks feeling like it was also important to have leadership, teaching and learning, and professional development. Hand it back over to you, Paul.
Thank you. So it definitely seems like a balanced approach to supporting this type of work or any large-scale initiative is important. And that is one factor that we really wanted to stress on the front end of this presentation, is that when we were mapping this out, we really wanted to make sure that this is about short cycle improvements. And to do that, we really needed to make sure this work was grounded in a framework that provided very specific and very concrete evolutions of improvement, not broad theoretical constructions. And so one model that one might consider, and the one that we used, was the Center for School Turnaround in 2017, came out with this model around 4 domains of rapid improvement. This model has been enhanced in 2018 with the partnership with NERN to further communicate what these 4 domains mean relative to cultural shift, turnaround leadership, talent development, and instructional transformation. So just know that the work that you're going to see throughout the course of this webinar was grounded in a model that was meant for systemic and continuous improvement.
So this is Ryan Maas talking. I get to talk about the fun pieces here. So in consideration of research is kind of where we started our journey. Ideally, that's where everyone should start, but I know sometimes that's not easily accomplished. But and this is not an exhaustive list of the things that we looked at in research, but as far as the impact of social emotional learning, we have the classic meta-analysis from 2011 that does support its positive impact on academic outcomes and improved behavior outcomes. The 2017 meta-analysis that's noted there in follow-up notes the long-term impacts and the sort of global impacts of this type of work. The study in the left-hand quadrant there notes the absolute return on investment, 11 to 1, is pretty sizable of this work, an investment of local district dollars. And in the bottom right, there is a physician's paper that was done by the Brookings Institute that noted this work has generational impact in many ways, and put it out there as an essential core component of every child's education. So taken together, all of this sort of manifests in a really compelling case that no harm could possibly be done by doing work in SEL. So there's this massive volume of research that supports us moving forward with it. And that was not, obviously not exhaustive, but that was part of the examination that we undertook before we started our journey with this project. So we established this summary understanding of research locally, and we're very fortunate in the fact that Michigan has an early childhood and all the way up to grade 12 competencies and indicators framework that is well aligned with CASEL. So we've got research and we've got our state providing a very clear rationale of how to do this work, but despite this, it's still really difficult oftentimes. And there's lots of other priorities that cloud and obstruct, and it's just another thing oftentimes it's interpreted as, but it's not. And with that, there becomes this sort of predictable natural response of a delay between a conceptual framework and guidance being levied and handed off to districts, but then this implications for practice. So our approach was to quantify the present impact of something that everyone had a reference point to, and that was office discipline referrals. So Barrett and Scott have a formula that provides a gross calculation, but a calculation nonetheless, of instructional time lost and administrative time lost in regard to office discipline referrals. And we were able to go back and calculate based on our systems, our raw numbers, and I'll draw your attention to the very final point there, that under administrative time, each one of our districts lost, on average, a little over 2/3 of one full-time administrator to the exercises of documenting office discipline referrals. So if the research in and of itself, as I went through on both those meta-analyses and some of the return on investment studies, makes it pretty profound, this is something that hits people in their day-to-day life and work. And to imagine that they would get that much time back locally makes that transition into this new type of practice possibly much easier. So that insight occurred through, first, the title of the slide is Making the Best of What's Around. We thought we're very fortunate that many of our and most of our districts use the same school information system. And within that system, we were able to standardize the data capture process for office discipline referrals. We started off in many different platforms. We funneled it all into one. What that did for us was it made our resulting data common. And because of that, there was that standard in data, it made it possible for us to visualize it. We did that through a free tool called Google Data Studio. It could have been done with any other analytics platform, but functionally what we have is a query that updates from a database, and because of that, it pulls from every single district in our region, and we're able to access that database across multiple years. Taken all together, the end result was we were able to pool the data, establish some trends regionally at the regional level, the district level, the school level, the grade level, and the individual student level. As a school psychologist, having worked for some of these local districts, this seems like a significant improvement over historical practice. And it's very pretty and very interactive, but at the same time, it's inadequate in many ways. It's fantastic for monitoring what has already happened, but it's very difficult to have insights of what are we going to do now to improve the quality of outcomes. So that's where we were at, and which compelled us to move into an action plan. And Paul is going to introduce the first part of that next.
Ryan, we temporarily lost Paul, but it seems like he is back online. So hopefully he will be jumping back in and sharing his screen in a moment.
Ryan, are you able to see my screen now?
We're able to see your screen, yes. We just finished up and we were talking about how these are wonderful insights, but we needed something more.
Thanks, Ryan.
Yep.
So the going from the research into the dashboards ultimately needed us to have a conversation around what are the themes that are starting to emerge. And so this was our first formal step to have district level teams or building level teams begin looking on the far right-hand side and bring or draw forward the themes that emerge from what we have historically done. And we felt that was really important because that was the most common or most well-known mode of communication or data dialogue was the behavior dashboard. So on the far right, they identified themes that crossed the grade spans. And again, intentionality was drawn on the left-hand side to bundle K2, 3.5, and 6.8 together, because that is ultimately what the state competencies are bundled as. In the center, we needed the opportunity for the conversation to start to nest within what a direct assessment was communicating so that we could do a direct comparison between what the direct assessment data was identifying as patterns or themes at grade spans against what our ODRs or office discipline referrals were communicating across those same grade spans. So at a high level, the sequence of activity really carried a multi-step process. The first step was identifying the behavior dashboard and the trends that were emerging. The second step is we needed to enhance the way our assessment was being used to get that direct assessment at the standard or competency level. The third step that we needed to have then was what curriculum was being used and how do we make short cycle improvements relative to the resource being used. So we wanted to show you the resource that was built. This was shared out in previous webinars, but again, this is a resource that anyone's welcome to, and we'll share it out. We'll share the link out again. But this is just a quick overview of how taking the data, quickly connecting it to competencies can yield specific targets. So in my model, I'm just going to say that our data said we needed to work around self-control. And so by selecting self-control, we get this reference point from a high-level national perspective of what CASEL says the definition is. They use the word self-management all the way through what our Department of Ed has as their rationale. I am going to select on the K2 bundle, just as our example. And what is drawn forward here then is the 3 different benchmarks that are available for this grade span. So I can cleanly see, like we do on the academic side, to look at what standards might we focus on. But I also here get my curricular audit or curricular resource so that we as a team can really take at the lessons that we're using to determine if there are specific lessons that we may need to revisit, or perhaps an entire cohort of students that are deficient in self-management might have never received this critical core instruction, and that might be our simple next move. So again, this was just a quick overview to show the resource that we built to explicitly connect the dashboard into the direct assessment to ultimately reside into a tier 1 audit to derive action.
So after our districts had gone through the process of examining their data and establishing maybe a clear understanding of that data through what Paul just described, we went to the big boys and we cited a foundational plan that was built off of the Handbook for Social Emotional Learning, Research and Practice. It's a citation from a book that was published in 2015. And there are 4 main components: leadership, teaching and learning, professional development, and the learning environment. These are the big pieces that were going to be a part of any district's plan, hypothetically. You'll notice the coloration that is given under each of them. That didn't come from the handbook in 2015. That's in relationship to the school improvement model that Paul introduced earlier. And so the intent was to align quality improvement practice with content-specific action planning. And you might notice in comparison, it's not a perfect relationship, but it was something that we were trying to remain aware of as we progressed through the design of this process. So we've got these big 4 that we built around. And the idea that we wanted to permeate through the whole thing was that it's often too daunting to even start, or it feels like it at least, but that we could chunk it out in a way that makes the work more accessible and attainable. With that also being flexible for each district with what their plan can be, but everything that they're going to be doing is being introduced against this backdrop of quality indicators and markers. So one of those domains might work, all of them might apply. It's really up to the district that we were giving that space to. But let's see some examples. Paul's on leadership right now, it looks like. So leadership is first for many reasons. Well, because of how essential it is to have leadership driving what's going on. And its relationship to that school improvement model is, the descriptive term was turnaround leadership. So the key here is to prioritize improvement and communicate the urgency. It's about setting goals short-term and long-term, as well as targeting supports to database needs. And a lot of that is possible after having assessment data to inform decision-making. The key here is that leadership means you have like a captain or captains that understand how compelling the research is and how potent the impact is. And I'll bring forward the Brookings Institute study or paper that was provided earlier, just how this can have some generational impact if done right. So there are some examples of leadership activities that we provided to our districts that were participating. Next phase was teaching and learning, descriptively aligned with the instructional transformation phase in the improvement model. For me, this is where SEL features most, like the delivery of any other content. It's about establishing some capacity to respond to students' needs, provide a rigorous evidence-based instruction, and remove barriers. This is about what's being delivered, having some clear purpose, and taking advantage of what's already being done and maybe reframing it just to clarify that purpose locally. We gave these examples to our districts and had them examine them against their knowledge of their own local context. Stage 3 for professional development, it relates to talent development in the improvement model. And there is a relationship here to training programs for new teachers, but also veteran teachers. For many people, this is new learning. And if you've been in the field for a while, it could just be about enhancing the quality of what's going on. The key here is, and this goes back to the leadership, the two earlier phases that I just described, it's about setting clear performance expectations and using those to target professional development opportunities and relating those to the needs defined by data. The final phase, this is a cultural shift, and in many ways, this reflects the first three all coming home to manifest. It's that the environment communicates through artifacts that this work is important and meaningful. It relates a transition to instruction and away from disconnected consequences to problem behavior, which is where we started our journey in examining our office discipline referrals. Evidence like, in that final bullet point, I'll draw forward, evidence like a discipline policy that understands the developmental stages of learners in social emotional learning and skill reinforcement through instruction rather than punishment. So these were the big four that we built around, and there's a loose relationship with an improvement model. But the idea, again, was that we were trying to make the process not too daunting and sort of break it up. We left a space for each district to reflect on their opinion of what's going on in their context and take advantage of what are some real quality indicators of work in SEL.
So to build on Ryan's last section, sites at this point have gone through two key milestones. So just kind of resetting the stage. So the first step was to take that office discipline referral and merge it with the direct assessment outcomes. The second step was what Ryan just covered, is they looked at the 4 pillars or 4 domains and began to isolate for their use and for their data sets what would make the most sense and what would yield the greatest amount of improvement. This is really that step 3 in the sequence, in which we drew forward those domains clearly at the top. So we have leadership, we have teaching and learning, professional development, and learning environment, and then took them through, similar to a comprehensive needs assessment or a level of program evaluation, a series of questions that they would take each bullet point that they drew forward from step 2 and put it through the protocol here to ensure that there is clarity and continuity of understanding across the leadership team of what does quality implementation of this thing mean to us locally, to set the stage for step 4. So this step was really the time where they got to pause. Some sites would go back into step 2 after they would go through this protocol to realize that after you go through these questions, there might be something that would have a larger return on investment.
Okay, so the final document that we had districts go through was to take what Paul just described and lay it down across a year. Local districts know their schedule of work. And this breakdown, we were thinking, makes the steps easier to engage in and compels a clear sequence of activity in consideration of those natural cycles that are already occurring. For me, what this did, having sat with a couple districts as they engaged in the process, it pulls the action plan development from sort of a conceptual experience into an actual experience. This is how it's going to go for us. And the one-page expression of it also opens the door to follow up and collaboration, being able to see professional development needs. It's nice to see it all on one page. And I don't know about for those of you that are in attendance today, but I've found myself a couple of times in my career filling out pages and pages of compliance and or fidelity checks for what I think is often very well-intentioned work, but the documents themselves, unfortunately, end up becoming the work rather than the action. So the design intent of something like this was to keep it all on one page, see it across your school year, and then make it manageable for yourselves. To do nothing is the only bad option. So this was the subtle, yet I think a pretty significant tweak to what Paul had introduced as that first step in this process.
So going back to the start, these are just some initial reflections as to where we sit now within our journey, is going back to the school improvement model, really thinking about, have we been balanced in our approach? And in some of our past initiatives, there's been a high priority of professional learning or professional development, but there hasn't been much focus around other domains. And so in this conversation, we wanted to make sure we were grounded and that our evidence was balanced across all of the domains to increase the likelihood of success. One thing that I think we constantly thought about in terms of our team was some of the research from Chamberlain, Brown, and Saldana in 2011 that identified that even with the support of skilled implementation teams, usually you can expect about an 80% success rate of the use of effective practices within a 3-year sequence. And so we really wanted to make sure that we weren't over-reliant on any single driver and to really be balanced in our approach. And so these are just some of our initial reflections on what we've done under each category to attend to the greatest success possible, or to yield the greatest potential success. So things like in turnaround leadership, definitely providing a structure or framework by multiple stakeholders are able to sit around the table using a common set of data to engage in implementation was a success. Around talent development, as you saw earlier, the identification of targeted and specific needs was easier to attend to for local schools. The culture shift, this becomes setting the stage for some new ways that work may be done, but to also allow maybe some historical practices that are not yielding the evidence that we had hoped to be able to let go to free up space for new practices. This was really important with the Barrett and Scott research that was drawn forward just about the reinvestment. If we're not spending so much time in behavior, could we reinvest it in a more productive and healthy way for both the students and the adults? And then lastly, the instructional transformation piece, just around putting volume of effort toward improving the things that seem to be addressing the majority of our student population. So this is flipping the script a little bit with getting the conversation around SELs dealing with a one-on-one child, and instead attending to looking at themes or looking at trends and really looking at cohort performance and what are things that we can do to the greatest majority possible to take advantage of whole group instruction for both quality and efficiency purposes. So at this time, you've seen briefly the process that we have worked on to support our local districts in their work to attend to SELs. And we would like you to use the chat feature now and just respond as a part of our team now in a variety of different settings. So you've heard our story. So what do you see as our next step, our next key step in implementation to be successful? So we have a wealth of experience attending to this webinar. So we want to take advantage to collect up some data from ourselves and just see, you've heard a little bit of our story. What do you think we need to consider as our next key step from your perspective? So if you don't mind in the chat window, just we'll be quiet for a couple of minutes, and if you could post that, that would be appreciated. Definitely appreciate the feedback coming in. We'll give about 30 more seconds. And Ryan, if you want to monitor chat and see if there's anything you would like to address specifically or add additional clarity before we ask our last question. Okay. Feel free to keep sending those ideas in, because they become a great audit for us to make sure we've accounted for a lot of these. We definitely won't go one by one to address them, but what I really appreciate is the variance of perspectives that are being collectively voiced to ensure that our next steps are as accurate as possible. So thank you for taking time just to help us in our journey. Just to restate kind of where we started from, this is our attempt to identify the best possible practice for our use, but I also think we're very connected to the fact of it wouldn't be continuous improvement if we got it right the first time. So we'll definitely take advantage of your notes. Ryan, is there anything you would like to address before Nova uses the next poll?
No, and I think I really do appreciate everyone's feedback from what I'm seeing and trying to distill it down in some patterns quickly as it moves very fast across my screen. But to me, I saw the need for parent and community involvement and continued work, ensuring access to quality SEL curriculums and materials, and then really I saw more opportunities to continue the work, tweak, so really just perhaps a common, almost like a PLC for this work in our region. That to me is what I extracted from the feedback. But I do definitely appreciate everyone's participation in this. It's extremely helpful as we navigate what would be phase 2 of our supports to our region.
So Nova, do you mind using the second poll?
Absolutely. So we're going to launch our next poll. And our question is, so for you in your role in your school or district, what key areas would yield the most improvement in supporting quality social emotional learning implementation? And you'll see a familiar set of choices here from our earlier poll and from the material that Paul and Ryan have been walking us through. We've got leadership, teaching and learning, professional development, and then the learning environment. And we're getting lots of answers in. We'll give it a few more moments here. Okay, great. Thank you all for participating in our poll. It looks like, once again, learning environment was one of the most common areas that folks really feel like critical to supporting quality SEL implementation. But really all of the other areas also really important: leadership, teaching and learning, and professional development. As was talked about in the presentation, all really key and can have different priorities based on what's currently going on in your school or district at any moment. But it's important to, as shown by the poll results that you're sharing with us, to really keep an eye on all of these key variables. Thanks. I'll turn it back over to you, Paul.
Thanks. Yeah, and I just wanted to note that looking through the chat window, integration and frequency are definitely two words that come to mind when I look at that. And I just think about taking advantage of that. And even in that data set that we just collected from the poll, I feel like a lot of times relative to the SEL conversation, we tend to lead with PD. And I think we have attempted to flip that a little bit in the sense of let's make sure it's targeted professional learning, and that actually becomes a byproduct of it. And so just to reiterate, I think Ryan has done a great job of bringing forward what is the research said, what is the data said, really to help trigger that local, the local buy-in for the localized context as the rationale to why do we need to do different work as the adults. And I just want to note that the formula that was identified for the instructional design as well as through NERN is really taking a look at three key things have to be in place for improved student outcomes, which is really having those effective practices with effective implementation with that enabling context are those three critical variables. So again, I just really appreciate your input. I think it confirms some of the things we knew, but we definitely have some unique permutations that were noted in the chat window. So with that, Clark, we are transitioning over to you, just thinking about, you've been a part of the conversation with us for a little bit. You've now heard the webinar and you've seen the data surfaced by our participants on that buy-in with leadership. So what are your thoughts relative to the conversation?
I think it's been an amazing conversation, and I really appreciate the presentation that you and Ryan did to share with our community how you guys are putting some of these, what sometimes can seem like abstract ideas, into concrete practice in really sophisticated ways. I agree with Ryan's assessment of some of the themes that were coming up in the chat window, that parent to community buy-in are clearly important themes, both from the chat window and the poll, that leadership, professional learning are clearly important, as well as teaching and learning. I know that one of the poll responses came up a little bit stronger than the others, the buy-in, but it was pretty much neck and neck, which says to me that all of these elements are really, really important to successful implementation of effective SEL programs, that none of them can be neglected to stand a reasonable chance of doing a good job. And one of the beautiful things about the presentation that you guys did and the work that you're doing at TBA is I think it really reflects thoughtful efforts in all four areas, both to promote buy-in, to provide professional development, to support teaching and learning, et cetera. So it's a complex endeavor, and I guess one of the things I would add is that the piece that xSEL Labs, I think, plays in supporting the work is just providing high quality social emotional student competence assessment data to inform the kinds of conversations that you're having with your team and decision making about how to address SEL. It's one small piece of a fairly complex puzzle. And we really appreciate your sharing the entirety of that puzzle with the team. I know that a couple of folks asked in the Q&A window about whether the presentation was going to be available on the website. I think there are a lot of people who want to spend some quality time with some of the examples that you both gave. And just to let folks know, that both the presentation, or recording the presentation, and a PDF of this presentation will be available on our website tomorrow. And one of my colleagues, Rebecca, will post the link to the actual site where you can download this into the chat window. So keep an eye open for that contribution to the chat window. I want to just close by saying a couple of things. One is, thank you so much, Paul and Ryan, for a wonderful presentation, and really for sharing, I think, what I believe is going to be a really useful example of putting these ideas into practice for our community. We're really grateful for your contribution to the conversation. And second, I just want to let folks know that next week we're going to be picking back up with the theme of looking at a specific social and emotional competence, describing why it matters, talking about how both through formal and informal means it's possible to assess that competence, and then talking about how to address it. And next week we will be focusing on relationship skills, and we'll be looking at the Michigan standards as we have been, but I do want to just reiterate that this concept of relationship skills is common to all standards in states that have adopted SEL standards. And let's face it, relationship skills are important everywhere, not just in Michigan. So hopefully the content of the presentation will be relevant to everyone in the community. So again, big thanks to Ryan and Paul for your contribution, and thanks to everyone for participating today. I don't know, Ryan or Paul, if you saw any questions come in either through the chat window or the Q&A that you wanted to address. I do see a question that just came up about describing specific staff roles and responsibilities in Tier 1. I don't know if you want to take a crack at that one, Paul or Ryan, but I think that would be helpful because I bet a lot of people have that question.
I was going to go quickly back through. Are you able to still see the presentation that I'm flying through?
Yes.
Okay. So yeah, we wanted to be mindful of time, and the one question I was going to address is, I think it was floated up there earlier, just about access to resources. So we will definitely make sure that Clark has the files for both the website that's been created, as well as the document of our action planning, our planning template. So if that's of help, feel free to use it, or even better, if you modify it and improve it, let us know, because we would like to use the improved version. But within this, the conversation around that adult level behavior really came up when you really drill into your benchmarks and strategies. And so we have kind of a little in-house joke that we call these Clark's picks, because Clark helped us review our state standards, and we drew out from his perspective, in combination with our Michigan approved competencies, which of these make the most sense to use. So this is the K2 bundle that is focused on children identifying and managing their emotions constructively. The conversation around what role do staff play and their responsibility in Tier 1 really became apparent when we started looking at these benchmarks and realized, do our staff know what these are? And this is by no means an exhaustive list, but this is also why it was essential for cross-departmental collaboration. We are lucky enough to have our itinerant teams have participated in this conversation and continue to participate in it, as well as our engagement behavior specialists. So this is just a starting point to the conversation, but there are more strategies that could be used to help execute the benchmarks. The other place that really drew attention to the staff's role, and Clark has many of these on his website already. So I know we have Sanford Harmony is another example of that. But going back to that Tier 1 audit, looking at the curriculum, again, this is second step in talking about, oh, Unit 2 had a lesson on identifying feelings. Let me go grab that and see if that's something I could redo with my staff. So I do think because of the action planning template, it drew back the obligations that the adults have, which came through in that page 4, which is that timeline articulation of who owns what obligation for success. And Ryan, I don't know if you want to build on that at all.
Well, I usually have simpler takes. For me, Tier 1 is all kids, therefore it's all staff, all the adults that work with those kids. So if there's that collective consciousness that exists across all the adults, it's never absolute for their relationship with like their specific support that they might offer, but that they are aware and can appreciate it and can use it to build on their work with kids.
And Clark, I don't know if you can address, I know we just had a question come up uniquely, and I know you have mentioned this throughout your webinar series, just how similar many of the states' standards or competencies are. But I know we just had a question come in about the uniqueness of Illinois and New York specifically.
Sure, absolutely. I actually have not reviewed New York's SEL standards, but I certainly know Illinois' and about a dozen others pretty well. And I think that there's much more commonality than there is difference when you look at standards between states. There's a paper available on the CASEL website that analyzes all the standards in terms of the extent to which they use the CASEL competencies or another framework. And I think 14 out of 18 states or something like that essentially base their competencies that are in their standards on the CASEL framework. So that's part of the reason there's such commonality in the kinds of skills and dispositions that are described in state standards from one state to another. There's some difference, and of course you want to look at your own state standards, but my feeling both from reviewing the content of the standards and also at a kind of gut level is that what social and emotional competence is, is really, it's both complicated, but it's also one set of competencies that we want children to be able to demonstrate. And that, I think, is reflected in the common features across the different states. I have one question that I've been dying to ask you guys about Ryan and Paul. So I'm gonna hog this last question, which is when you think about the kinds of professional learning supports that you think are most effective for helping teachers to do SEL well in the classroom, What do you think is kind of best practice, and how are you putting that into practice in TBA districts?
Well, this would be the time that it would be great to have video to see who made eye contact first between Ryan and myself.
That's why I didn't have my camera going.
That's right. I think it's a good question. I would say from my perspective, where the focus tends to be when I'm dealing with behavior or supporting behavior in classrooms or in schools is really talking about effective integration of quality instruction. And so I feel like there are so many things on plates for people. A large part of this is just distilling it down to the simple fact of, if you want academic gains, we need to have behavioral gains to ensure cognitively they're ready for the higher demand of what the standards call for. So I think an efficient summary would just be, and we had actually a bunch of people note this in the chat window, so I appreciate that. The idea of how do we integrate this notion of social emotional competency or expectations across the continuum of all of our learning environments, that starts well before they start first period, and it will continue going on well past the time they walk out of the hallway. So it's a community of effort that understand that our role is to ensure kids are always cognitively ready for the challenges of the academic standards.
Excellent, thank you. All right, well, we're at about 10 minutes to 1. Are there any other questions or themes that came through that you, Ryan and Paul, would like to address as a sort of parting comment and response?
For me, it would just be a sheer appreciation for this type of work, and us being able to network with so many people is really a privilege. And so our hope is that, I think we've started a good story, but by no means is it finished. So our hope is that we get other fellow SEL experts like you on the webinar right now that provide input, provide feedback, challenge the thinking, because I think if we can collectively contribute to improvement, it will yield more successful implementation in student and adult outcomes. So for me, it's just a sheer appreciation of people taking time out of their schedule to engage in a conversation, to hear our story, but we hope it's just a starting point.
Well, I think I can safely speak for everybody on the webinar in thanking you both for sharing your story and for advancing the conversation in a number of districts by doing so. So thanks again, Ryan and Paul, for sharing the story. If anyone else would like to learn more from Ryan and Paul, well, this recording will be up on the website, as will the slides. And I don't know if you guys want to share your contact information. I bet you get inundated with questions, but I know that lots of districts around the country could learn from your example.
Yeah, we'll definitely be happy to share that on the resources. So if people are interested, happy to have conversations.
Okay. Thanks very much, everyone.
Thank you.